On the Sunday morning of August 28th, 2005, the heat in New Orleans already seemed to have a weight of its own, like a damp cloth laid over the skin. That stifling feeling typical of late August on the Gulf Coast, when the humidity doesn't let up even early in the day. At the community center on St. Bernard Avenue, near Gentilly, the air conditioning ran without rest, and still there was sweat on the backs of necks and in the palms of hands, because the constant coming and going of people and the crowding made the cold air unable to keep up. A boy named Davi, 10 years old, sat on a varnished gym floor, his back against a column of peeling paint, holding a plastic toy car in his pocket so he wouldn't fidget too much. He didn't understand the difference between an advisory and an order, but he understood what he could see: adults gathered in front of a small tube television, the image trembling on the corner of a folding table, staring at the screen as if it were a doorway. His mother, Eliane, gripped the strap of her purse too tightly, as if the purse were the only solid point. The neighbor, Mrs. Lenora, had come in flip-flops and held a cardboard fan from the Baptist church on the corner, the kind handed out at services, fanning nonstop in a rhythm that seemed to be trying to push the air away. A man from the neighborhood, Travis, who picked up odd jobs repairing roofs, kept repeating that they'd seen worse storms, but his voice came out thin and uncertain, like someone trying to convince himself before convincing anyone else. Davi watched their faces and felt that something was about to split in two right there, between the smell of disinfectant on the floor and the whir of the fan, amid hurried footsteps and chairs scraping across the gym. The reporter on television spoke at a pace that seemed too fast to fit inside New Orleans. Beneath her words, a banner said the city was at risk, and the name Katrina appeared as if it were the name of someone already at the door, repeated on maps and arrows pointing to the Gulf and the Louisiana coast. Outside the building, along St. Bernard Avenue, cars hurried past in both directions, some with mattresses tied on top with rope and tape, others with trunks left open because nothing else would fit. There were pickup trucks with boxes and black garbage bags stuffed with clothes, as if life were being packed in a rush into whatever container could hold it. The community center had become a place for people to lean and wait, waiting for guidance, waiting for some authority to say what to do without leaving room for doubt. But doubt was already there, and it showed in the way each adult did mental arithmetic with memory and with what they had in their pockets. Who had a car and who didn't, who trusted they could get a ride and who would rather risk the buses, who believed what City Hall said and who remembered old promises that hadn't been kept, and how in earlier storms, what was announced didn't always arrive the same way for everyone. Davi didn't know maps and didn't understand the lines on weather screens, but he knew his street and the sound of houses when it rained hard, the snap of gutters, water hammering on roofs, and the way wind finds cracks. He also knew the change in adults' posture when they felt the ground could disappear from under them. Conversation shortens, hands start counting invisible things, and eyes fix on some point as if searching for an exit. His mother had been born in New Orleans East and worked at a hotel in the French Quarter, folding sheets and collecting towels. She knew the city by what she cleaned and by what she crossed on the bus, on routes that cut through neighborhoods and schedules, with time measured by shifts and stops. Davi's father no longer lived with them and made deliveries when he could. Sometimes he showed up with a bag of groceries. Sometimes he disappeared for weeks. At the community center that Sunday, Eliane spoke little, as if each word cost something. She had a piece of paper with phone numbers handwritten on it, and an address in Baton Rouge for a distant cousin. Davi looked at that paper as if it were a fragile talisman, too light to hold a city, but too heavy to ignore. When the broadcast switched to an official statement, the sound seemed to sharpen, as if the TV had adjusted itself. A deep voice announced a mandatory evacuation for the city, the formal phrase that came from above and dropped like weight. It wasn't a politician's name that stayed in Davi's head. It was the word mandatory, which sounded like a hand pushing. The adults reacted in different ways, and for the boy that was more striking than any explanation. Mrs. Lenora made the sign of the cross and looked up at the ceiling as if searching for cracks. Travis let out a short laugh and said it was an exaggeration, but he was already pulling his cap from his pocket, as if preparing even while denying it. A younger couple argued in low voices, urgently, about gasoline and the bridge, about which exit might still be open and how long it would take. An older man in a dress shirt, whom Davi only knew by sight, said the Superdome would open as a shelter and it was better to go there because at least it had infrastructure, a big, familiar building with doors and security. Someone else answered that he didn't trust it, that they promised infrastructure other times and people were left in the dark, remembering that when the power goes out, the size of a place doesn't become comfort. It becomes only more space for waiting. Davi saw, in that moment, an old line drawing itself between people, those who had learned to trust institutions and those who had learned to trust only acquaintances, relatives, people who owed favors. Trust and distrust had names and histories the boy didn't know, but he could read them in gestures, in the way someone held a purse, in the way someone avoided looking. Eliane moved closer to Mrs. Lenora and asked about her son's car, which sometimes sat parked on the street. Lenora looked away and said he had left early with his wife and the boys, and there wasn't room for anyone else. It wasn't said with malice. It was said with a hard sincerity, like someone who had already calculated space and risk and couldn't pretend otherwise. Eliane nodded as if she had expected it, as if the refusal were just one more number in a sum that wouldn't come out. Travis, hearing this, offered a ride back to the house to pick up things, but he didn't guarantee a seat to leave the city. He had an old pickup that drank too much gas and a sick mother who couldn't walk far. His promises came with conditions, and everyone there seemed to understand, because conditions were also a way of telling the truth when there was no extra to spare. The community center smelled of weak coffee and anxiety. Coffee made in a thermos and poured into disposable cups. Someone had brought a box of donuts from Winn-Dixie, and children ran around with sugar on their fingers, not really knowing why, as if their bodies were still trying to keep an ordinary Sunday. Davi didn't run. He watched a woman in nursing scrubs, wearing a badge, talking to someone else about Charity Hospital and about patients who couldn't be moved, people tied to beds and routines that didn't fit into a quick evacuation. He watched a young man in a Saints t-shirt, nervous, talking about reversing traffic on the highways and about people stuck in I-10 gridlock, repeating what was being said on the radio and television about the ways out of the city. Each sentence felt like a puzzle piece that didn't form a calm picture, only a drawing of urgency. Eliane crouched in front of Davi and fixed his hair with a small comb she carried in her purse. She said in a voice too firm to be just a voice that he needed to get up and grab his backpack. Davi had a blue backpack with a zipper that snagged, and inside it there was a notebook, a pencil case, a t-shirt, and a toy he insisted on bringing. Eliane didn't argue. She simply accepted what could be accepted in that moment. She also put in a bottle of water and a packet of saltine crackers, things that don't spoil easily and can fool hunger for a while. On her face, there was a decision that didn't come from the television. It came from a calculation done in silence, with what fit in hands and on the body, with what could be carried without falling. That same Sunday, the sky began to change color, turning milkier with a dull brightness that didn't look like fair weather. The wind moved the trees in a way that wasn't the usual afternoon breeze, steadier, more insistent, as if it were testing things. A volunteer at the community center, a thin man in a vest, handed out flyers with evacuation routes and emergency phone numbers. He spoke patiently, but his eyes looked tired, as if he had repeated it 100 times in a day, and as if he knew paper doesn't turn into transportation. Eliane took a flyer and folded it carefully, putting it away as if it were money. She didn't have a car. The evacuation bus was a promise without an exact schedule. The cousin in Baton Rouge was a name on paper. Mrs. Lenora couldn't help. Travis could take them to some point, maybe to the Superdome, but he didn't guarantee it. And the later the afternoon got, the clearer it became that the city was full of decisions that had to be made without guarantees. That was when the moral no one announced appeared and imposed itself. When a city orders people to leave, the order lands on different bodies with different weights. Davi saw it in the way some adults already had suitcases ready, with duct tape, with plastic bins, like people practiced at packing up a life. Others, like Eliane, improvised with grocery bags and a folded blanket, trying to turn little into enough. And there were still those who stood still, saying they would wait a bit longer. Not out of courage, but because they had nowhere to go, because waiting is sometimes just a lack of alternatives dressed up as calm. Eliane decided to go to the Superdome, not because she fully trusted it, but because she needed a concrete place, an address big enough to exist when everything else seemed to slip away. The community center began to empty in waves, like a tide. Those with cars left first, with looks that asked forgiveness without saying it. Those who depended on buses stayed longer, forming lines, asking questions, arguing, trying to wring certainty from someone. Eliane called Davi and pulled him to his feet. He felt her hand squeeze his with a force that hurt, as if pain were a way to guarantee presence, to keep the world from taking what she could still hold. They walked to the corner, where Travis sat with the pickup running, the hood trembling. His mother, a small elderly woman, was already in the front seat with a pillow in her lap. In the truck bed, there were 2 suitcases and a black garbage bag full of clothes, tied down so it wouldn't fly off. Travis said he could take Eliane and Davi to near the Superdome, but afterward he had to go pick up his sister in Araby. Eliane nodded and climbed into the bed with Davi, holding the backpack against her chest. The truck bed smelled of gasoline and wet wood, with use-worn marks and dust stuck to it. The boy looked at the street, at the low houses, at porches with plastic chairs, and had the strange feeling that he was seeing everything as if for the last time, without knowing what last time meant when you still don't have a choice. Traffic toward downtown was heavy, but still moving, with long stops and short starts, as if the city were breathing with difficulty. They passed Claiborne Avenue and saw stores boarding up their doors, people nailing wood over display windows, others carrying jugs of water, a man pushing a refrigerator on an improvised handcart. The pickup's radio talked about contraflow on I-10 and lines at gas stations, pumps running dry, and people driving around hunting for fuel, as if escape depended on a liquid that was also running out. Near the Superdome, there was a mass of people walking with bags, children in arms, elderly people in wheelchairs. Police officers directed them, but the direction felt more like a gesture than a plan, because the crowd had its own rhythm and its own urgency, and each person carried a different reason to walk faster. Travis stopped on a side street and said he couldn't go any farther. Eliane climbed down with Davi, thanked him with a nod, with no time for ceremony. Davi watched Travis drive away and felt a sharp edge of fear. The ride had been a short bridge, and now they were in the middle of a river of people. Eliane pulled Davi by the hand and entered the flow, moving toward the dome, with firm steps, like someone who couldn't afford to hesitate, because hesitation there meant losing the rhythm and being swallowed. Inside the Superdome, the air was heavy and smelled like too many people together. Sweat, packaged food, nervousness, plastic, and damp fabric. The floor was covered with blankets, backpacks, bags, people sitting in small clusters, trying to mark territory with what they had, as if outlining a square on the ground could recover some control. The sound was a continuous hum of conversations, crying, footsteps, announcements that not everyone heard because not everything carried through that mass. Davi looked up and saw the enormous structure, the lights, and thought it looked like an artificial sky, too high to feel intimate. Eliane found a spot near a wall where she could lean and not be exposed in the middle. She spread a thin blanket and told Davi to sit. Beside them, a family from the lower Ninth Ward organized a bag of diapers. An older man in a hat kept repeating that in 1965, with Betsy, it had been bad, but that this here would hold. Another answered that he didn't trust anything too big to be cared for, as if size were also vulnerability, not protection. In the early hours of August 29th, the wind outside turned into a roar. The Superdome trembled slightly, as if it were breathing, with vibrations coming from the roof and the doors. Davi tried to sleep with his head in his mother's lap, but he woke to noises, a distant crash, a shout, a baby crying. The sound of rain was constant, as if someone were dumping buckets onto the roof, and sometimes it came with sharp cracks that sounded like metal. Eliane didn't really sleep. She watched the entrance, the corridors, as if waiting for news, as if her gaze could pull information out of the air. The internal television, when it worked, showed images of flooded streets, but the picture cut out, came back, cut out again, and the sound failed, as if even information were tired and couldn't stay on its feet. When morning came, the world had changed. There were holes in the dome's roof, and drops fell in certain spots, forming puddles. People moved away from the leaks, dragging blankets and bags, reorganizing what little they had as if that could reorganize the day. The heat rose because the air conditioning failed, and the still air made clothes cling to skin. The smell grew stronger, sharper, harder to ignore. Water and food began to be distributed in small, rationed portions, with lines forming and breaking apart, because need didn't wait for order. Davi received a small bottle and a packet of crackers and ate slowly, trying to stretch time, as if chewing were a way to control the day, to keep it from collapsing all at once. By early afternoon, rumors ran like rats, that the levees had held, that they had broken, that the water was rising in this neighborhood, that buses were coming, that no one was coming. What was confirmed arrived in fragments, brought by someone who had heard it from a guard, by someone who had seen it through a door, by someone who had managed to catch a news report on the radio. The word levee began to appear in conversations, spoken with anger or disbelief, as if it were an accusation. Eliane heard a woman say the water had invaded New Orleans East, and her face hardened. That was where her story came from. Her mother still lived there, in a small house near Chef Minta Highway. Eliane had tried calling earlier, but her cell phone gave only dead signal, and the lack of a line felt like a lack of ground, an emptiness that hope couldn't fill. By the end of that day, the light became unstable. The Superdome felt like a lidded pot, collecting heat and people in time. Davi saw a man faint near a corridor and be carried away by volunteers. He saw an argument over space. He saw people praying in low voices, not to change what was already happening, but to endure what was still coming. There was no spectacular violence there. There was wear. There was an entire city compressed, waiting for someone to arrive with a plan, and the waiting carried the weight of hours without bathing and without news, a weight you couldn't see, but that bent shoulders. On the night of August 30th, something simple and final happened with the coldness of a household accident, and for that very reason, it stayed engraved forever. Davi went with his mother to an improvised water line. The floor was slippery in places because of leaks and spilled bottles, and there was small trash that stuck to shoes. The lighting was weak, uneven, and the crush of bodies made you lose your bearings. Someone bumped into them, and Davi, trying not to fall, let go of Elaine's hand for a second. It was only a second, but the crowd moved like a single body, pushing, closing gaps, occupying the place where connection had been. Eliane turned, reached out, called his name without shouting because shouting seemed useless in that noise. Davi tried to answer, but his voice disappeared. A tall man passed between them. A woman with a baby in her arms turned her body, and suddenly the boy could no longer see his mother's blouse. Only the backs and shoulders of strangers, as if the world had changed faces. Davi stood still, his heart pounding in his throat. He didn't know where to go, because every direction looked the same: people, bags, blankets, tired bodies. He tried to slip into a side corridor and ended up near a door where a guard stood. The guard asked his name, and Davi said it, his throat dry. He asked his mother's name, and Davi said it. The guard pointed to an area where volunteers gathered lost children. Davi was taken there and sat on a metal bench with two other children who were crying. He didn't cry right away. He went rigid, as if his body were trying to conserve fear, saving energy for what might come, because their even panic seemed to need rationing. Eliane spent hours searching. She went back to where they had been, asked blanket neighbors, ran corridors, spoke to volunteers. The Superdome was too big for a search done by one person, and communication was too small to help, with announcements that didn't always reach and too many people to recognize. When she finally found the children's area, it was already early morning. Davi saw his mother approach with a face marked by exhaustion and relief, and in that moment he understood something he didn't have words for. Separation could happen without warning, without malice, simply because the world was too tight, and because when everything moves together, 1 second becomes distance. They hugged quickly, not for lack of love, but because hugging there was difficult and the space around them never stopped. Eliane held his face in both hands, looked into his eyes, and then tied a piece of blue cloth around the boy's wrist, torn from an old t-shirt she had in her bag. With a pen, she wrote her name and a phone number that might work someday. She did the same on her own wrist with Davi's name. It was a small gesture, but it was a decision to trust not the system, but a handmade mark, a simple method that fit on the body and didn't depend on signal. In the days that followed, waiting became routine. There was no water for bathing. The heat made the air heavy, and time seemed to drag without offering rest. Davi watched adults try to keep some order: lines, shifts, help for the elderly, people fanning with cardboard and pieces of poster board, as if any movement could push discomfort outward. He also watched distrust grow like mold. People hiding food, people accusing others of cutting in line, people saying they had been forgotten there. Eliane shifted between patience and irritation. She shared crackers with an older woman trembling with weakness, but she saved the last bottle of water for Davi with a firmness that allowed no argument, because protection there was made of small decisions repeated until they became rules. On September 1st, more information began to arrive that buses would take people out. The word Houston appeared. Astrodome, someone said, as if it rhymed, a place as big as the dome, but out of the water. Davi didn't know where Houston was, but he understood it was far, and far was a chance to leave that smell and that heat, to leave that waiting that had already become skin. When lines finally formed for boarding, there was controlled shoving, people trying not to lose their place, clutching bags as if they were documents. Eliane held Davi by the strap of his backpack and kept her hand on his wrist, where the blue cloth itched, as if the itch were a physical reminder not to let go. Leaving the Superdome was slow under harsh sun. Outside, the city looked like a broken set. Fallen trees, crooked signs, pooled water where it didn't belong, and a strange silence in streets that used to be loud. The yellow school bus had hot vinyl seats. Davi sat by the window and watched the dome fall behind them, huge and silent, as if it held inside it what no one wanted to remember. Along the way, they passed flooded stretches, houses with water halfway up, people waving from rooftops. Eliane turned her face away, so she wouldn't look too long, but Davi looked because he still didn't know how to look away, and because looking was also recording, as if memory needed proof. In Houston, at the Astrodome, the light was clear and cool, and there was a smell of cleanliness that felt strange after so many days, a smell of disinfectant and new fabric. Volunteers handed out new blankets, hygiene kits, water. People spoke more softly, as if the sound of the disaster had been left behind on the road, and as if bodies were still learning not to shout. Eliane looked for a phone to try to reach her mother in New Orleans East, but the lines were still bad. She managed to reach the cousin in Baton Rouge, who said she couldn't take anyone else because the house was already full. It was a refusal spoken in a tired voice, and there was no fight. Eliane thanked her and hung up slowly, as if the act of hanging up were also the act of accepting, without romanticizing, without turning need into offense. In the days in Houston, Davi watched his mother fill out forms, speak with social workers, stand in lines that seemed more organized but were still long, with clipboards and papers asking for names, addresses, dates. He saw people searching for relatives on bulletin boards, with photos taped up, names written on paper, short messages. He saw a man recognize a woman from the neighborhood and cry without sound, as if his body no longer had strength for noise. He saw Eliane sit in the stands and stare at nothing for a few minutes, as if her mind had stayed in New Orleans and her body was there out of obligation, doing what had to be done because there was no alternative. The definitive news arrived not as a dramatic scene, but as a sentence in the middle of a bad connection, a few days later, when they finally reached someone they knew who had stayed in the city and then gotten out. Eliane's mother's house, in New Orleans East, had flooded. The older woman had been rescued to a shelter in a school and then transferred to Baton Rouge. She was alive, but she had lost almost everything. Eliane closed her eyes when she heard. Davi saw her jaw tighten and understood that losing a house was something a phone call couldn't undo, because a house isn't only walls. It is routine and proof of existence, the place where life confirms itself every day. When they could, Eliane and Davi went to Baton Rouge on a relocation bus, arriving around mid-September. The city felt high and dry, and that gave a strange sense of safety, as if the ground wouldn't betray you. They stayed in a borrowed room in the home of an acquaintance of Eliane's mother. Not the cousin who had refused, but a woman from church who had a couch and limited patience. Eliane's mother was there, thinner, with the look of someone who had seen too much water. She hugged her grandson tightly and then kept holding his wrist, reading the blue cloth as if it were a prayer, as if name and number were protection, as if writing on the body could keep the world from separating them again. Life became a sequence of tasks: enrollment in a temporary school, job searching, trips to offices for assistance, line for donations, scheduled appointments, and waits in rooms with air conditioning that was too strong. Eliane got a cleaning job at a motel near Airline Highway. She left early, came back tired, with the smell of cleaning products on her hands, and with her body learning a new route, a new geography of survival. Davi began attending a school with children who had also come from New Orleans, and at recess the conversations were about neighborhoods, about streets, about what had disappeared. At night, he heard adults talking about insurance that wouldn't pay, landlords who didn't answer, jobs that had vanished with the water, and lost documents that had to be replaced, as if rebuilding began with paper before it began with brick. What had happened in the Superdome, the 1-second separation, changed the way Eliane moved through the world. She began pinning an extra key to Davi's clothing, repeating the address where they were staying, asking him to memorize a phone number. It was discipline without violence, but inflexible, born from a fright that didn't pass, because the fright had become method. Davi, in turn, began to look at crowds the way you look at the sea. Beautiful from far away, dangerous up close. He didn't say that, but his body said it, growing quieter in crowded places, keeping his hand near his own wrist, where the blue cloth was already fraying, as if the loose thread were a warning that didn't need a voice. In October 2005, Eliane managed to return to New Orleans for one day, in a ride organized by a church, to see what was left of the apartment in Gentilly. Davi stayed in Baton Rouge with his grandmother. When Eliane came back, she brought a bag with only a few things: a photo album with pages stuck together, a dented pot, a wall clock stopped. The apartment had been broken into, and the water had stained the walls up to a height she showed with her hand, as if marking a child's growth, as if that line were a measure of what had come in and what it had taken. She didn't bring furniture because there was no way. She brought what fit and what still meant something, even ruin, because meaning also takes up space, and sometimes it is the only thing you can carry without breaking inside. Over time, some people from the community center reappeared in their lives by chance, as if the scattered city still had threads. Mrs. Lenora called once from Jackson, Mississippi, saying her son had lost his job and they were trying to return. Travis showed up months later in Baton Rouge, thin, with the pickup finally broken for good, saying he had spent weeks helping clean out houses, that his mother had gotten sicker, that his sister had gone to Dallas. He apologized for not having been able to take Eliane out of the city that Sunday. Eliane said there was nothing to apologize for. The sentence came out simply, and still it was true. On that August 28th, each person had measured the world with the ruler they had: fuel, space, obligation, the weight of someone in the front seat, and fear of what still had no name. By December, Davi could remember New Orleans without his stomach tightening every time. He remembered the smell of beignets at the French market, a musician playing trumpet near a corner of the quarter where his mother worked, the sound of rain on tin roofs. But he also remembered the Superdome, the darkness, the heat, the hand letting go for 1 second. Memory didn't choose only what was beautiful. It kept what had been necessary to survive, like an archive that doesn't ask permission and doesn't organize itself to please. In early 2006, Eliane found a small rental in Baton Rouge, a 2-bedroom apartment with worn carpet, but with doors that closed and windows intact. Davi's grandmother stayed with them. Life settled into an unglamorous rhythm. Work, school, church on Sundays, occasional calls to acquaintances still scattered. Eliane kept the crumpled evacuation flyer in a drawer, along with new documents and receipts. It wasn't a keepsake to show, it was proof that a piece of paper can push an entire city, and that the response to that push depends on what each person has and whom each person believes, and what they can reach with their own hands when the order arrives without bringing the path with it. On a warm spring afternoon, Davi sat on the porch of the new apartment and watched his mother and grandmother folding clothes on an improvised clothesline. The blue cloth on his wrist had already been replaced by another, cleaner one, but he still kept the first in a shoebox, along with the plastic toy car and the old notebook. The city where he had been born continued to exist in news and conversations, in promises of rebuilding, in photos of streets full of mud. For Davi, New Orleans also existed in the way his mother looked twice before crossing a street, in the way his grandmother fell silent when she heard heavy rain, in the way he himself searched for exits in any crowded place, as if measuring doors and corridors without noticing, because the body learns maps the mind doesn't draw. The mandatory evacuation of that Sunday had not been only an announcement on a television in a community center. It had been the moment when old relationships appeared without disguise, when trust became a vehicle and distrust became protection, when refusals were spoken without cruelty and offers were made without guarantees. What remained afterward was not a clear lesson, but a set of habits, marks on body and thought, small objects saved from damage. And when night fell in Baton Rouge and the air finally cooled, Eliane turned off the apartment lights calmly, checked the door once, then again, and sat on the couch between her mother and her son, the three of them looking for an instant at the ordinary quiet of a remade home. Not the same as before, but whole enough to hold them. If you found this story meaningful, please consider liking this video. It helps these quiet, often forgotten stories reach more people. Subscribe to Ordinary Lives, Extraordinary Times to stay connected to stories of everyday people who lived through moments that shaped history. Each life mattered. Each story deserves to be remembered, but we'd also love to hear from you. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Our community spans across countries, generations, and experiences, all connected by a shared respect for history and the lives within it. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping keep these stories alive.